Hey y'all, I'm Rachel ALTman and welcome to UnALTered Truth. I want to wish all of you a Merry Christmas today. I know that this is a political show, but I really hope and pray for you that your Christmas and New Year aren't clouded by politics and that you can truly share this time in peace with the people who matter to you. If you're watching me talk right now while you're in a room with your loved ones, I promise I won't be offended if you put this video on pause and watch it tomorrow. 2020 has been turbulent to say the least. And when everything else is uncertain, the shared bonds and relationships we have in our life become even more sacred. I'm so grateful to have had this platform with BetheChange for the last couple of months. I'm even more grateful for this audience and the kind comments and messages I've received from so many of you. Even if we haven't spoken to each other directly yet, I want you to know that you make my life brighter. That said, I am about to get to the news now and the lump of coal that Congress tried to give us this week. So feel free to come celebrate Christmas in quarantine with me the way I celebrate it every year, eating Chinese food and seeing movies, and keep watching. This week, the Senate passed a massive spending package of over $2 trillion, which funded appropriations, other bits of legislation, and $900 billion of COVID relief. Y'all know me well enough to guess that I'd have a lot of questions about any piece of legislation spending that much money. Our federal government constantly wastes taxpayer dollars. Politicians and experts often seem to think that they know how to spend your money better than you do, and yet they're proven wrong again and again as they keep spending on bizarre foreign programs and campaigns to shift human behavior toward what they think is best for you. I would actually love to be able to parse through the spending package and pick out for you exactly which elements of it I think are important and which I think are wasteful. Unfortunately, I can't do that today, and I guarantee you, neither could your legislators. Why? Because it's over 5,500 pages. Most House members in Congress had just a couple of hours to read and synthesize these thousands of pages. Senators as well had under a day. What an absolute joke. Let me just visualize this for you. According to tax policy expert Chris Edwards from the Cato Institute, if you printed it out and laid out the bill the Senate voted on from beginning to end, it would span nearly a mile. Senator Mike Lee said that just printing it out, not even reading it, would take over 3 hours. I am a fourth-year college student taking 7 classes a semester, and I don't think I read that many pages for class all year. That's not a confession to my professors, it's an indictment of the disgrace that is our legislative process. Our legislators have a duty to thoughtfully consider the bills on which they vote so they can actually represent their constituents and deliver them what they deserve while saving them from having their hard-earned money misused and their rights infringed. This week, they physically could not fulfill that duty. They were given over 5,500 pages that could have contained anything and were forced to form an opinion that would bind the American people within hours. You wouldn't sign a 5,500 page contract you hadn't even read within a span of hours. You know you'd be an idiot to do that for yourself or your family. But our politicians were expected to make that kind of snap decision not just for themselves but for the whole country. I'm trying, but I can't even put into words how disgusted I am. There can be no good governance when our representatives can't even read the bills they pass. On procedure alone, this spending package is a national shame. There's been a lot of misinformation about how the passage of the spending package actually worked. So this is what I've learned from the digging I've done. The House used a process called dividing the question to pass the package through 2 separate votes. One vote was for a big chunk of the omnibus spending bill, so that was separate from the COVID funding, and it covered appropriations for commerce, justice, science, defense, financial services, and homeland security. Voting against a major appropriations bill like this is always unpopular, but for members of the House, they didn't have COVID-19 hanging over their heads when deciding whether to fund our science and defense priorities. The COVID funding was tied to a separate vote, but it's also not really fair to pretend that our legislators were voting on that $900 billion relief plan as its own individual item, when it was actually still bundled in with other appropriations like for agriculture, energy, labor, foreign affairs, and more, as well as a bunch of other areas of legislation that for some reason ended up in this behemoth of a bill. To provide their constituents with important progress on COVID and relief from the economic burden they're suffering, members of the House basically had to blindly sign off on whatever BS and special interest carve-outs were included in those other sections of the bill, which, might I remind you again, they couldn't and didn't read. Senators had it even worse. They had to decide on the legislation as one enormous spending package with all of the above. And there was good COVID relief in that bill. It wasn't just the $600 handout, but also new paycheck protection loans, expanded unemployment benefits, vaccine distribution funding, and more. It wasn't perfect. It could have been tweaked, like to cut some regulations around rapid self-tests, for example, but overall, it provided funding that's genuinely important for our COVID recovery. Sadly, senators couldn't vote for that COVID relief without also voting for every wasteful and ridiculous item in the other $1.4 trillion in spending. A yes to COVID relief was also a yes to $10 million for gender programs in Pakistan, a yes to $35 million for sexual abstinence schemes, a yes to new Smithsonian museums, and a yes to tax breaks for racehorse owners. Some people are framing this package as a bunch of weird provisions stuck into our COVID bill, but it's actually a COVID bill that was jammed into an already bloated omnibus to manipulate members of Congress into going along with the waste and excess, all for the sake of winning $600 checks for their constituents. It took guts to say no deal to that proposition, and I actually have a lot of respect for the few politicians who voted against it. The way I see it, there's a clear reason to vote no. There was no way to fully and truly know what was in it by the time of the vote. The real burden is on the members who voted yes to justify why they took the plunge on a spending package they never even read. Rarely will you hear me say this, but when it comes down to it, I actually agree with Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez when she said, "This isn't governance, it's hostage-taking." Party leaders in the political establishment know that under ordinary circumstances, no sensible politician would agree to an omnibus spending bill neither they nor their staff had ever read, or to one with so many oddly specific provisions that they wouldn't have nearly enough time to debate, or to one that their constituents wouldn't have more than a few hours to weigh in on. So, they chose manipulation. They knew that people were angry that Congress still hadn't passed additional COVID relief checks. They took advantage of that anger by tying COVID spending with dozens of other items that could have been separate, and leaving members to face the rage of their constituents if they voted with even a shred of fiscal responsibility. But in reality, the members who voted no on a 5,500-page, $2.3 trillion package they weren't familiar with have shown much stronger principles than the leaders who chose to put them in that situation in the first place. If our leaders in Congress really cared about COVID relief, they would have negotiated and passed it as its own separate bill so other concerns wouldn't be a distraction. Nope. They forced politicians and their constituents to take on the huge burden of the appropriations bill just to get one section of COVID funding. What they did was dead wrong, and they should hear a chorus of voices across the country telling them that. So raise your voice. Talk to your neighbors, friends, and family and see if they also think that Congress should do better. And then take action. I know wasteful federal spending isn't the sexiest issue, but every day you spend ignoring it, lobbyists and advocacy groups are visiting your elected officials and convincing them to spend on their special interests. Those of us who want to see responsible, transparent spending need to be just as organized and just as loud and persistent. Then maybe next year, we'll get a better Christmas present from Congress. I'll see you next week.